In the long winters of the Second World War, the Soviet Union faced both catastrophe and resilience. Across vast territories where snow pressed against wooden barracks and industrial smoke filled the air, a surprising element of resistance emerged. Tens of thousands of women entered roles that were often left out of official stories. In black and white images, their presence lingers as both ordinary and extraordinary. Close portraits show stern faces under plain uniforms. Wide photographs capture their gathering on parade grounds. Mid-shots reveal documents stamped and folded, carrying dates that sometimes conflict with the surrounding accounts. The official history described these women as stepping forward with patriotic zeal, a seamless force woven into the great victory. Yet archival fragments suggest a more complex picture, where deployment records might not align with public declarations, and where service could include both symbolic display and practical function. The truth lies between ritual and necessity. Some women may have fought directly, others may have carried burdens that sustained the front in quieter ways. Each story is filtered through institutional corridors and later commemorations, where memory was shaped by what was written and what was left unsaid. What remains is not certainty, but a layered history, presented in clipped headlines, file stamps, and silent photographs. This program will follow that trail, beginning with the first steps into training fields, moving through rail stations, administrative offices, frontline scenes, and finally into the decades of remembrance. The images remain monochrome, the meaning still contested. Chapter 1. Echoes. From the training fields in the early years of the 1940s, when the Soviet Union was bracing itself for invasion, young women began to arrive at isolated training sites scattered across the interior. The landscape was bleak and austere, dominated by snowdrifts, long barracks, and the distant rumble of supply trains. Black and white photographs capture the setting with stark clarity. Wide shots show crowded yards where recruits stood in uneven rows, their uniforms often too large or too worn. Close portraits highlight serious faces, marked less by triumph than by resolve. Mid-shots focus on folded memoranda, their paper worn thin, stamped with dates that sometimes appear inconsistent with later records. These women were officially described as mobilized for direct service, a powerful narrative that reinforced unity and determination. Yet some evidence suggests that their early training may have served not only a military function, but also a symbolic one. The presence of so many women in uniform may have been used to project resilience and inspire a weary population, even if their deployment was not always as straightforward as official records claimed. The daily rhythm of the training fields appears orderly in surviving documents. Exercises are logged, attendance is recorded, and reports describe a progression toward readiness. Still, annotations in margins and adjusted reference numbers hint that not all names matched subsequent postings. Some rosters seem to have been revised, possibly to match later needs or to reflect official expectations rather than actual outcomes. This creates a tension between what is visible in the monochrome photographs and what is implied by the paperwork. In one frame, a wide shot of a snowbound yard suggests hundreds prepared for combat. In another, a mid-shot of a file stamp indicates uncertainty about where and when those recruits were later assigned. The training fields thus serve as both a physical and symbolic beginning. They represent the mobilization of women in a time of crisis, yet they also mark the beginning of a narrative shaped as much by policy as by reality. For the women themselves, it was a moment of transformation. Civilians in plain coats became soldiers in formal uniforms, their hair cut to regulation length, their movements now dictated by drills and commands. The photographs show the scale of the effort, but the documents suggest a less straightforward story. Some may never have reached the front. Others might have been reassigned to roles not publicly acknowledged. Still others may have faded from official records altogether, despite their presence on those early parade grounds. In the black and white imagery, the atmosphere is at once stark and monumental. Snow covers the ground, breath clouds in the cold air, and the uniform lapels of recruits are turned up against the wind. A clerk marks attendance on a roster, the stamp pressed hard into the page, its date oddly misaligned with the handwritten entries beside it. Such small details are easy to overlook, yet they offer a subtle reminder that records are not always consistent. A later official file might suggest that training had begun weeks earlier, while the stamp indicates a later start. These contradictions may not change the broad outline of mobilization, but they hint at the fluidity of record-keeping during a time of crisis. Beyond the documents, the human scale remains essential. For many of these women, this was the first time they left their villages or towns. The black and white portraits, though silent, suggest a mix of determination and uncertainty. Some faces are youthful, others already marked by hardship. All stand against the same monochrome backdrop of fences, barracks, and snow. The training grounds became a place where personal history intersected with state policy. They also became the first point at which official accounts began to diverge from lived experience. The broader question remains, were these training sessions primarily about preparing effective soldiers, or were they also about crafting a powerful image of unity? The photographs suggest both. Rows of recruits marching in formation appear impressive when viewed in a wide shot. Yet close images of ill-fitting uniforms and inconsistent documents suggest that practical readiness might not have always matched the image presented. The ambiguity remains, preserved in both paper and photograph. This opening chapter, anchored in the cold and disciplined training yards, sets the stage for what follows. From these fields, the women would travel eastward, their journeys recorded, in stamped documents and remembered in images of crowded rail platforms. It is there, on the platforms of departure, that the next stage of their story unfolds. Chapter 2: Faces on the Rail Platforms. The railway station stood as a threshold between the known and the uncertain, a gray expanse where steam and coal smoke blurred the edges of the day and where men and women moved with a purpose that was both hurried and ceremonial. Black and white photographs of this stage show several distinct types of shots in a single sequence. Wide archival crowd images of platforms crowded with figures, close-up portraits of faces turned toward an unseen departure board, mid-shots of clerks at tables with folded memoranda, and exterior transit views of trains lined like dark teeth against the sky. Women in plain coats and plain uniforms appear in these images, their uniform lapels bearing the crease of hurried fitting, their hands clasping small satchels or wrapped parcels. Some portraits capture a quiet resolve. Other wide shots convey mass movement and the scale of mobilization. Station officials and ticket clerks appear in mid-shots, bent over ledgers and handwritten lists. The paper trail created at these points is uneven. Some rosters are clear and direct. Others overlap and contain marginal edits that appear to reflect rapid changes in planning. One file stamp in a departure folder does not match the recorded time on the manifest, suggesting that departures were sometimes backdated or reorganized after the fact. These kinds of indicators may point to logistical strain rather than deliberate obfuscation. They may also suggest that authorities adapted documentation to meet shifting needs, rather than allowing every discrepancy to remain unresolved. The photographic sequence itself hints at multiple narratives. A wide view of the platform conveys a single, unified departure. A close-up of a folded memorandum on a clerk's table reveals notes in different inks and a margin where a name has been crossed out and rewritten. Such visual juxtapositions suggest that what was visible to the public might not fully match what occurred behind the ledger. The women who waited on those platforms came from varied backgrounds. Some had experience in industrial work. Others were teachers or clerks. Many had left family behind. Their clothing is uniformly practical. A plain civilian coat appears beside a formal uniform in a single frame, showing the transition from everyday life to organized service. Soot smudges and scarf edges are visible in close-ups, while long shots emphasize the cue and the architecture of departure. The mood of the station might be described as solemn rather than frantic. Faces show concentration. Some show fear, though it is often subdued. Many show a practiced calm that could be interpreted as the result of training or of forced composure. The platform announcements in period audio transcripts are curt and procedural. They instruct persons to proceed to assigned cars and to present documents to clerks. Yet the documents presented often required clarification. A clerk might consult a folded memorandum, then look up and consult a supervisor, and then adjust an entry in a ledger. The ledger itself may contain overlapping rosters, with later names written over earlier ones in a way that seems to reflect last-minute substitutions. These handwriting variations suggest reassignments that could have been routine, or they might indicate that paperwork was being reconciled to events after the fact. For the women, the act of boarding was not solely about movement. It was also about recognition and record. Some boarded and were marked in manifests that align clearly with later deployment records. Others left traces that appear only in personal photographs or in small notations on a folded memorandum tucked into an archive box. That mismatch is part of the chapter's tension. The images produced on platforms emphasize motion and collective purpose. Yet the documentary record sometimes shows gaps. A file stamp pressed into a departure form might bear a date later than the photograph taken on the platform. Such a discrepancy could be explained by administrative delay. It could also indicate that some departures were formalized after they occurred, perhaps to meet reporting needs or to align with propaganda narratives. The presence of overlapping rosters with altered margins serves as a second indicator that paperwork was not always contemporaneous with action. These modest anomalies do not negate the broader reality of mass movement. They do, however, complicate simple narratives of linear deployment. The human consequences of that complexity were real. Families watched trains pull away. Letters from these women to relatives show both practical details and emotional restraint. In some surviving midshots of personal effects, a photograph peels from a wallet and a handwritten note folds into a satchel. These private items often outlast official records. They provide another form of evidence that might confirm or contradict ledger entries. The images on platforms thus function on several levels. They serve as visual proof of mobilization. They also act as theatrical displays of unity that could be repurposed in later public messaging. A wide archival crowd photo, printed in a newspaper, might later accompany celebratory text that simplifies the reality of who went where and under what circumstances. Conversely, a close-up portrait reproduced in a family album preserves an individual trajectory that is not always visible in institutional files. The interplay between public presentation and private record creates interpretive openings. It appears that some movements were strategic and instrumental. They might have been used to reassure urban populations or to inspire workers in factories. At the same time, the same movements may have involved pragmatic reallocations that left some women in logistical or support roles at distant stations rather than in direct combat roles at the front. The distinction matters for how later accounts framed their contributions. The station scenes also expose the administrative apparatus that mediated movement. Clerks, stamp pads, ledgers, and folded memoranda are present in midshots as instruments of order. Officials stamped forms, attached tags to baggage, and aligned names with assigned cars. But where paperwork contains overlapping rosters or where a file stamp does not align with a manifest entry, those instruments of order reveal their limits. They suggest that in the pressure of wartime transport, documentation could be provisional. Such provisionality could have practical consequences for pay, pension, or recognition long after the train stopped. Records that were adjusted may have altered eligibility for later benefits. Those adjustments might have been minor clerical corrections. They might also have had lasting effects on how service was remembered and recompensed. In interviews recorded decades later, some women reported discrepancies between what they believed they had done and what the files recorded. Their testimonies often align with the indicators found in station archives, such as margin notes or inconsistent dates. That alignment suggests a continuity between lived memory and documentary anomaly. The photographic motif of the train platform recurs as a symbol of departure and of uncertain arrival. Close-up images of uniform lapels and folded memoranda reiterate the personal and the administrative threads of each journey. Wide shots of crowded platforms emphasize scale and collective movement. Mid-shots of clerk tables focus attention on the documents that would shape later histories. The chapter does not resolve whether every discrepancy resulted from error, expediency, or deliberate decision. It does suggest that the station was more than a site of transit. It was a point where public narrative and private experience intersected, sometimes cleanly and often messily. For those who traveled, the platform moments left physical and bureaucratic traces. Photographs and personal notes survived, ledgers and stamped forms survived too. Where they agree, the record is clear. Where they diverge, questions remain. From the platforms, the women became part of larger systems that determined their roles. Some continued onward to operational zones, others entered support roles along supply lines. The next phase of this account moves from the public spectacle of stations to the quieter, more bureaucratic corridors where service was cataloged and certified. There, the folded memoranda and file stamps from the platforms would be filed, contested and reinterpreted, shaping both recognition and omission in later years. Chapter 3. Inside the corridor. Records in narrow corridors lined with metal cabinets, paperwork accumulated like the years. Clerks moved between desks with steady hands and tired eyes. The rooms smelled faintly of ink, dust, and coal smoke. Close-up images show file stamp impressions pressed deep into thin card. Mid-shots capture folded memoranda stacked beside typewritten rosters and hand-jotted notes. The institutional rhythm is calm, procedural, and persistently bureaucratic. Records were created to order service, pay, and placement for many individuals. Some files present a clear chain from induction to reassignment. Others reveal gaps, corrections, and later amendments that complicate the story. It appears that some entries were altered to reconcile competing reports. Papers document assignments that are straightforward and entries that are crossed out and rewritten. A changed reference number in one box suggests administrative reclassification at a later date. A clerk's pencil note in a margin indicates an unresolved query about posting. These modest anomalies appear repeatedly across different series of folders. They do not by themselves disprove the broader record. They do, however, suggest administrative pressure and the difficulty of maintaining perfect contemporaneity in wartime. In many cases, files served multiple functions at once. They were administrative proof for pay and benefits. They were also artifacts used for political narratives. Registers might emphasize participation that supported a broader morale campaign. At the same time, personal letters and photographs preserved individual trajectories that sometimes diverged from official catalogs. In a close portrait, a uniform lapel bears a small crease where a medal may once have sat. In a mid-shot, a folded memorandum lies open on a desk with inked calculations. These objects link the human presence to institutional processes. The corridor thus functions both as an archive and as an instrument of memory. Decision-makers use these documents to confirm service. Later committees consulted the same volumes to assign pensions or commendations. Where a file stamp bears an inconsistent stamped date, questions arise about when an event was officially recognized. In other instances, an entry reappears with an altered docket sequence, suggesting reorganization of files after the fact. Such indicators are not uncommon in large administrative systems functioning under stress. They nevertheless carry consequences. A delayed stamp might mean delayed pay. A shifted reference number can complicate entitlement claims decades later. For veterans and their families, these bureaucratic details mattered. They shaped access to housing, work preferences, and public recognition. The correspondence tucked into folders often contains pleas for clarification. The tone of these letters is practical and sometimes plaintive. Writers request confirmation of service, copies of missing documents, or corrections to entries that affect their futures. In several midshots, a clerk stamps a request form and writes a brief explanation on the reverse. The exchange of letters sometimes reveals a quiet negotiation between individual memory and institutional need. Photographs reproduced in personal. Scrapbooks often counterbalance the dryness of ledger entries. Close-up portraits show faces lined with experience and stoic composure. Wide shots of assembly halls display women in neat formation, their uniform lapels turned toward the light. These images entered the files alongside typewritten reports. The juxtaposition of image and ledger invites varied interpretations. In one box, a commendation file includes a folded memorandum with a handwritten marginal note suggesting a reclassification of role. In another, a personnel card lists an assignment that differs from a personal photograph caption. This interplay suggests that the archival record is not monolithic. It is the product of many hands, decisions, and moments of adaptation. The corridors also reveal institutional priorities. Certain series of folders are meticulously maintained. Others are sparse or contain only fragments. Where files are thin, it may indicate loss, reorganization, or selective preservation. Over time, committees and agencies decided which records to retain and which to discard. Those decisions influenced later histories and public narratives. When anniversaries arrived, curated selections from these cabinets often appeared in newspapers and public displays. Those selections shaped memory more than the totality of the boxes ever could. The presence of margin annotations and penciled queries points toward active curation. Archivists and administrators annotated files to clarify provenance or to flag inconsistencies. Those annotations sometimes record explanations. They sometimes raise further questions. The corridor thus becomes a place of ongoing editorial work, not mere passive storage. The human labor in these rooms is central. Clerks were responsible for reconciling manifests with personnel cards. They verified names against folded memoranda and compared dates across series. Their decisions could be pragmatic, intended to make records usable. They could also be conservative, preserving older notations rather than erasing them. This layered approach to records creates palimpsests of service, where earlier entries remain visible beneath later corrections. The result is a textured archive that requires careful reading. Interpretation therefore rests on both documentary evidence and contextual understanding. Historians and claimants alike must read line by line, matching ink to impression and photographic caption to ledger entry. The work is slow and exacting. It rewards patience and punishes assumptions. At the same time, the corridor reflects broader policy choices. Administrative practices codified how service was recognized. Those choices influence social benefits and public commemoration. When records are complete and consistent, they support smooth adjudication. When they contain anomalies, they create disputes that can last for generations. Families and researchers find themselves returning to those cabinets seeking clarity. The motif of the file stamp recurs throughout these scenes. It anchors moments of official recognition and bureaucratic closure. Yet the stamp can also reveal delay, as when its inked impression is dated months after a photograph was taken. Similarly, the folded memorandum serves as a microcosm of the archive. It contains orders, notes, and sometimes personal comments that do not fit standard forms. Its presence suggests that not all decisions were formalized through neat channels. Some were negotiated at desks and then recorded imperfectly. Such informality is as much a part of institutional life as the formal forms themselves. The corridor's visual language is austere and unadorned. Metal cabinets, stamped forms, and worn folders dominate imagery. Yet within that austerity lie human stories. Each folder once represented a life in transit, a service rendered, a labor performed. The archival process translated those lives into administrative categories. That translation was rarely neutral. It prioritized some roles and framed others as auxiliary. The implications of that framing extend beyond recognition. They affect pensions, honors, and how descendants understand family histories. As researchers move from cabinet to cabinet, the questions multiply. Which entries reflect standard practice, and which reflect expediency under duress? Which annotations indicate clerical error, and which indicate purposeful alteration? The answers are seldom absolute. They require a measured approach that recognizes both the authority of documents and their human limits. The corridor records thus occupy a central place in understanding how service was recorded, remembered, and rewarded. They provide evidence and obstacles in equal measure. From these institutional halls, the inquiry moves outward to the contested spaces of the front. There, footprints of service and fragments of paper meet the realities of sustained operations, and the narratives that emerged at the front would return to the corridor to be written into permanence. Chapter 4. At the Edge of the Front Hat. The edge of the front, winter and mud define the landscape. Snow and churned earth create a monochrome field of uncertainty. Wide archival images show ruined villages and convoy routes under gray skies. Close-up portraits reveal faces intent and hands steady and cold. Mid-shots capture folded memoranda laid on crates and stamped manifests. Exterior convoy shots show trucks and supply wagons moving along rough tracks. Uniform lapels in photographs are creased by long wear and constant motion. Women appear in these scenes wearing plain uniforms and practical overcoats. Their posture is often compact and measured against the weather. The official accounts often frame such images as evidence of direct combat engagement. Alternative readings suggest many fulfilled hybrid roles behind front lines. These roles might include logistics, communications, medical support, and reconnaissance tasks. In some files, language moves from combat to auxiliary duty without clear explanation. The archival record therefore needs careful reading and contextual framing. One indicator appears in supply manifests bearing inconsistent stamped dates. Such mismatch suggests administrative delay or post-factum reconciliation of records. A second indicator appears as margin annotations on deployment charts. These notes sometimes indicate reassignment or retrospective clarification of duty. Both indicators point to friction between field practice and formal documentation. In photographs, close-up portraits often show a uniform lapel punctuated by a small badge. That badge may indicate training or role rather than frontline combat. Wide views of convoys emphasize the scale of support operations required at the edge. Mid-shots of supply depots reveal women organizing crates, checking manifests, and marking folded memoranda. These images convey purposeful labor rather than celebratory heroics. The visual motif of the file stamp recurs, anchoring moments of official recognition. Yet the stamp's date occasionally lags behind photographic evidence by weeks. That lag can complicate later claims about presence and assignment. It may also affect eligibility for recognition and benefits after hostilities. End. The human consequences are tangible and long-lasting. Women who performed essential tasks sometimes received less public acclaim. Their names appear in ledgers, but rarely in public chronicles. In personal letters, many describe fatigue, resourcefulness, and steady commitment. Those letters often survive where formal files are thin or inconsistent. The photographs and documents together form a partial record of action and endurance. Field conditions shape the roles these women could perform. Roads washed out by spring thaw restricted movement. Weather forced units into improvisation and reallocation of tasks. Command decisions might reassign personnel overnight to address pressing logistical needs. Such reassignments could be recorded later and then recorded inconsistently. That pattern appears across multiple series of deployment cards and manifests. The pattern also appears in first-hand accounts preserved in scrapbooks and oral histories. In one wide image, a line of trucks moves under a low sky. In a subsequent mid-shot, a clerk consults a ledger and updates lines of names. The juxtaposition suggests that paperwork often tried to catch up with operations. That instability does not erase the reality of sustained effort behind the front. It reframes how effectiveness can be measured. Combat impact can be direct and kinetic. Support impact can be structural and cumulative. Both shaped operational outcomes across entire sectors. The monochrome aesthetic highlights material conditions. Breath clouds, mud splatter, and worn gloves register as evidence of sustained activity. Close portraits show eyes that have witnessed hardship and adaptation. Mid-shots of loading ramps emphasize coordinated labor and disciplined routine. The presence of women in these roles sometimes appears to have shifted local social patterns. Where men were absent, women stepped into transportation, munitions handling, and unit communications. Those shifts could alter community expectations long after the fighting subsided. They could also intersect with official narratives that prioritized certain roles for public commemoration. The administrative consequences of role assignment are crucial. When records list service as logistics rather than direct engagement, benefits and honors may follow different rules. That administrative distinction might affect pension eligibility and formal recognition. Stamped forms and folded memoranda thus carry weight beyond immediate action. They shape long-term outcomes for veterans and their families. The archival anomalies, therefore, have human ramifications that reach decades into the future. Photographs that suggest presence at supply depots may be interpreted differently than paperwork asserting frontline assignment. Such divergence invites interpretive caution. It suggests historians must triangulate across multiple evidence types. Material traces like uniform lapels and crate tags can corroborate certain functions. Written traces like manifest dates can suggest timing and sequence. Oral recollections provide context and texture that documents alone may not convey. The interplay among these sources remains complex. Field improvisation also created hybrid tasking that resists tidy categorization. A woman might serve as a radio operator one week and as a convoy loader the next. Files may list a primary duty, but not capture temporary or emergent assignments. Margin notes sometimes hint at such transitions, yet they are not always comprehensive. This fluidity complicates narratives that prefer stable occupational labels. It also challenges how we assess contribution at scale. At the operational level, supply continuity determined frontline resilience. Road maintenance, fuel delivery, and ammunition transfer were indispensable. Women's labor in these areas therefore bears on operational outcomes. Photographs showing convoys and supply yards thus document contribution in structural terms. They speak to sustained throughput rather than isolated acts of combat. The archives reveal the tension between symbolic representation and practical necessity. Propaganda often favored images that simplified roles into heroic narratives. Actual practice tended toward adaptable, multi-purpose labor. That adaptability may have been undervalued in public pages and commemorative displays. It may nonetheless have been decisive on the ground. The chapter's black and white imagery underscores this contrast. Wide archival shots project scale. Close-up images reveal material detail and human presence. Mid-shots of documents and stamped ledgers link individuals to institutional processes. The recurring motifs, the file stamp, the folded memorandum, the uniform lapel, create visual continuity across disparate scenes. They help sustain a through line that connects personal labor to systemic logistics. Yet the motifs also expose inconsistencies when the documented dates do not align. Those gaps prompt questions about when and how roles were formalized. They also prompt deeper inquiry into who received recognition and why. The narrative here remains provisional. It does not claim to resolve every discrepancy. Instead, it frames the edge of the front as a contested zone of action, record, and memory. The contrast between what is publicly asserted and what appears in archival detail invites further scrutiny. From these contested edges, the story moves toward the processes of curation and commemoration. How later decades curated images and files determines how these women's service is remembered. The next chapter will examine those processes of remembrance and institutional selection in greater depth. Chapter 5. Memory Shaped. In later decades, in the decades after conflict, public ceremonies and publications guided collective memory and identity. Parades in city centers were photographed in stark black and white frames. Newspapers reproduced those images alongside clipped headlines and formal captions. Official narratives emphasized unity, sacrifice, and orderly recognition of service. Alternative readings suggest that selection and emphasis might have been shaped by institutional priorities. Public displays may have elevated certain roles above others for political reasons. The visual motif of the uniform lapel reappears in commemorative photos and official portraits. Close-up images of medals on lapels convey honor, while mid-shots of folded memoranda hint at administrative sorting. Families placed small framed black and white photographs on mantelpieces at home. Wide archival shots of anniversary parades show crowds and banners beneath austere skies. Behind those displays, file cabinets and records rooms continue to decide who qualified for acknowledgement. Administrative criteria might have favored visible combat roles over logistical or support functions. That preference could shape which names appeared in official lists and displays. A commemorative booklet might list certain units and exclude others without clear explanation. Margin annotations in anniversary files sometimes indicate late corrections or added names. These annotations can be an indicator that records were adjusted after initial compilation. In some commemorative volumes, an inconsistent stamped date suggests post factum reconciliation. Such inconsistencies do not necessarily indicate deceit. They may also reflect bureaucratic backlog and practical reclassification under strain. The presence of a misplaced file stamp can nonetheless complicate later pension claims. Families seeking benefits often confronted ledgers that did not match personal memories. Personal scrapbooks preserved photographs that did not always appear in public exhibitions. A folded memorandum retained in a private drawer could contradict an official citation. That private evidence often became crucial in later appeals for recognition. Oral recollections recorded in later interviews provide texture absent from formal lists. Those recollections sometimes align with personal photographs rather than institutional rosters. This divergence suggests the archive is a negotiated space, not a fixed ledger of truth. Historians must therefore compare images, personal papers, and administrative records carefully. The motif of the train platform recurs in veteran memoirs and in family albums. Many veterans recalled a single platform departure almost as a defining life moment. Official programs, however, sometimes reframed those departures within a broader narrative of national will. Such reframing could serve political commemoration needs in later years. Decisions about which images to reproduce in textbooks might reflect curricular priorities. Commemorative stamps and anniversaries may have amplified certain episodes over others. That amplification could marginalize quieter forms of service when shaping public memory. The institutional process of recognition often required documentary proof. Records with neat file stamps and clear references were easier to validate. Where reference numbers changed, claimants sometimes faced delays or denials. A changed reference number in a pension file can create bureaucratic ambiguity. Those ambiguities have human consequences across generations. Widows and descendants have petitioned agencies for corrections. Their appeals often involved submitting private photographs and sworn statements. Administrative protocols sometimes demanded multiple corroborating documents. In territories with disrupted archives, meeting those demands could be especially difficult. Loss of municipal records after conflict might leave gaps hard to remedy. Archivists and family members then relied on parallel sources like church registers or factory employment lists. Such substitutions could satisfy some administrative tests, but not others. The tension between archival completeness and lived memory became legally consequential. Laws and policies governing benefits often hinge on documentary thresholds. Small discrepancies in dates or designations can shift eligibility. As a result, policy design has long-term social effects. Recognition policies may shape who receives pensions, housing priority, or public honors. Those allocations, in turn, influence how communities narrate the past. Municipal memorials and plaques often reflect those administrative outcomes. A memorial plaque listing names might mirror a curated list from central records. Conversely, local memorials sometimes include names omitted from official registries. Those local acts of remembrance can challenge broader narratives. In some towns, family-led exhibitions preserved images and folded memoranda that state displays ignored. These exhibitions offered alternative readings of service and contribution. They could also prompt official re-evaluation, sometimes years later. Academic research drawing on multiple evidence types sometimes catalyzed bureaucratic reviews. Scholars, comparing file stamps to personal photographs, provided new leads. Their work occasionally revealed inconsistencies that merited administrative correction. Public history projects then helped bring neglected stories into circulation. Still, not all anomalies received attention. Some corrected files remained rare exceptions. The selective correction process itself might reflect political will. Memory, therefore, is not only archival, it is also institutional and procedural. The recurring visual motifs help tie disparate sources together. The file stamp anchors moments of institutional closure. The folded memorandum suggests ad hoc decision-making and informal records. The uniform lapel signals visible recognition. The train platform symbolizes departure and unresolved arrival. Together, these motifs create a through line across decades of representation. They also expose where documentary practice and social memory diverge. The aesthetic of black and white still frames how communities engage with these traces. Monochrome photographs connote distance and seriousness. They shape a solemn tone that helps legitimize commemoration. That tone may also obscure nuance and everyday contingency. A printed newspaper page from an anniversary edition might present a tidy narrative. The actual administrative record could be messy and provisional behind the scenes. That disjunction matters for families seeking justice and for historians seeking accuracy. It also matters for public policy designers aiming for fairness in recognition. Contemporary debates about restitution and commemoration often return to these archival tensions. New technologies and digitization projects can surface overlooked documents. Digitized ledgers sometimes reveal marginal annotations previously invisible to researchers. Conversely, digitization can also entrench curated selections, if not done inclusively. Decisions about what to digitize and what to omit are consequential. Communities therefore engage with archives as active participants in memory making. Grassroots projects can democratize access to family photos and folded memoranda. These efforts may broaden the public understanding of wartime roles. They also highlight how institutional records might underrepresent certain groups. Ultimately, the story of remembrance remains open. Official displays of honor and private acts of keeping memory alive coexist uneasily. The indicators found in files, stamped dates, margin notes, changed reference numbers, point toward a layered record. That layered record invites careful scholarship, compassionate policy, and continued public attention. The work of reconciling institution and memory may proceed unevenly. Yet it remains essential for understanding who was seen, who was recorded, and who was allowed to fade. The next inquiry must examine contemporary efforts to recover and reinterpret these traces in public archives, academic studies, and family narratives. Decades of black and white images, files, and memories converge without delivering simple closure. Pictures show uniform lapels, train platforms, and folded memoranda as recurring tokens. Official narratives may have streamlined roles for clarity and public reassurance. Alternative readings suggest archival gaps and selective emphasis shaped later commemoration. Family albums and municipal displays often tell differing versions of the same past. Administrative traces matter in concrete ways for pensions, honors, and social standing. Where a file stamp bears an inconsistent stamped date, claims become harder to verify. Where a record lists changed reference numbers, researchers must probe paper trails carefully. These anomalies might reflect bureaucratic strain, pragmatic reclassification, or selective preservation. Personal letters and photographs sometimes correct or complicate institutional accounts. Oral testimonies could align with private documents more than with official registries. The human consequences of archival ambiguity can span generations of families and communities. Digitization efforts and local collecting projects may broaden access and reveal hidden layers. Yet digitization can also reproduce curatorial choices if not pursued inclusively. Scholarly triangulation across images, ledgers, and testimony remains essential for balanced interpretation. Policymakers might use improved evidence to adjust recognition and benefits equitably. Public memory continues to be negotiated between institutional narrative and lived experience. The monochrome aesthetic preserves solemnity, but can also flatten the messy human record. Questions remain about who was visible, who was documented, and who was omitted. These unresolved tensions invite further archival work, community engagement, and legal review. Communities reclaim stories through exhibitions, talks, and family-led archives. Veteran voices might guide ethical curation and contextual interpretation. Historians will continue to weigh documents against lived testimony carefully. The archive remains open, inviting careful reading and renewed public attention.